Cereal, Antoine. Flour. Come make a charcoal. I got some business I got to tackle, Antoine. I hope we don't got to talk at all in Chinook. Sometimes I talk business real good in Chinook.
Television would start in July the 1st, 1952. And the CBC, hearing that they were suddenly going to be in television, started hiring as fast as they could, not knowing anything about it.
Live television, as well as film, was very meaningful to the audience and to those of us doing it, because people hadn't seen British Columbia on camera before. So that's what was so great. We not only brought actors and performers into the studio, but we took the cameras out into the province. So for the first time, people saw what the west coast of Vancouver Island looked like, or what a cattle drive looked like, or what the Fraser Canyon looked like.
But we were all on our own at that point because there was no way of connecting stations, as far as there wasn't any microwave, no landlines, no nothing. So television was a matter of individual local stations with kinescope recordings that we would do what was called bicycling. And you would bicycle the shows that you did from one place to another, so that we'd do a show in Vancouver one week, and if it was good enough that they wanted to use it, it would be shown in Winnipeg the next week, and Toronto the week after, and so on around the country.
The scene in Vancouver at that time was Wally Hamilton over at TransCanada Films, that was the lab, Lou Perry, shooting documentaries mostly for BC Hydro.
Lou Perry at that time was doing industrial films, documentaries. He was quite busy, actually. We had quite a big staff at that time, about 23 or 4 people on the staff, and had an art department and everything. It was quite a business.
To my surprise, Lou had a small studio, and out of his studio they were shooting a television series called Littlest Hobo.
The Littlest Hobo was the American TV series that roughly taught us what gripping and electrics and prop, what it was all about.
The real start was The Littlest Hobo.
KVOS was a station beaming out of Bellingham, and at that time, Vancouver was their market.
Well, they were I guess they earned the name of Border Bandit, but I think they were a good corporate citizen in Vancouver, because they established Canada West Film Productions up here, first the KVOS commercial division and then Canada West Film Productions, and poured a lot of money into this town. We mounted 2 serious assaults on animation through Hanna-Barbera. We hired 180 people at a crack usually, and it was in the old days of ink and paint and draw everything.
It was a feast or a famine, because as I know, when I decided to go freelance, it was a bit of a gamble. And I used to go collecting beer bottles in the alleys in Vancouver and cleaning windows. I used to go down streets, and I had an old van in those days, and I had a ladder on the rack. And I used to clean windows in between jobs, and I used to drive taxi for a little while too.
In between films?
Yeah, yeah. And I used to get home and the wife would say, well, phone's rang, Lou Perry or somebody else wants you, and give them a call. So and that's how it would go on.
The Sweet and the Bitter was actually the first feature that was shot in Vancouver with James Clavell, a very good writer, I must say. But the Trap really was the big film, the first big film that came to Vancouver.
I was a little bit apprehensive, really. I was sort of, it seemed so huge and so many people were walking around and doing things. It was almost overwhelming. There was 3 of us. I think there was 4 of us in the end. Fred Ransom, Fred Wharton, myself, Best Boy, and we had a group with us.
They realized that I was working with the CBC and said, look, if you're selected for this position, the position being second assistant director, are you prepared to leave CBC? And you should know that we'll be gone in 4 months and that'll be the end of it. And so I had to think it over because, married with a family, and I did. Of course, I'm very pleased that I did because I spent 3 or 4 months on that as the second assistant, and then we went back to England to finish it off at Pinewood.
I actually read about it in the paper at the time, and I heard that there were some films happening. I heard that they were doing The Trap up in Panorama Studios in West Vancouver. So I went up and knocked on doors and spoke to enough people to finally get a job. When we were shooting over in Bowen Island, I was standing watching a canoe scene with Oliver Reed paddling a canoe in circles, and not knowing who the man beside me was, I was suggesting I could probably give him a few lessons. And the fellow beside me turned out to be the producer, and he said, no, we won't give him lessons, we'll put a wig on you and a big bearskin coat. You paddle the canoe. So there's another little opportunity.
Panorama Studios was put together by a fellow called Aldrich Vaclavic, Czech, who came out to Kitimat and worked in on the Camano Power Line or one of those areas up there for a couple of years, and came back down to Vancouver, met a number of people, quite influential people, and managed to get a broker's license, I guess, because he raised the money for Panorama Film Studios with the help of Muriel May, who was the sales agent for British Pacific Properties at the time. But to this day, I don't know how he did it.
Panorama, from the time I got into the industry, which was 1968, 69, it was always fly-by-night. It was, the building of it was fly-by-night. Muriel May, God bless her, was an incredible woman. The fact that she actually convinced people to put money into that facility and to build it was great. But it was always almost a real estate deal as opposed to a working rental facility, So you never got a sense that it was open for business. You never got a sense that it was necessarily an asset. Although I have to say that even by today's standards, it was one of the better stages I've ever worked in.
Friday morning at 7:30 in the morning, my phone rings. And it says, Jim, yeah, this is Bob Altman. I'm up in Vancouver. It's perfect. What do you do? So I said, I'm a production manager. He says, can you get up here this afternoon, start prepping this picture? I said, okay. So that's how I got in the film business. So I flew up to Vancouver, and we started prepping That Cold Day in the Park.
Not very much happened until Altman did the Cold Day in the Park, That Cold Day in the Park. Magnificent set, New York apartment in the 50s, and Altman was such a stickler. He had, although he said, I don't intend to open the drawers, but I want them dressed. And you had to put cutlery and everything in that drawer that might have been used in case somebody went over and opened the drawer. Very disciplined person.
He was like, unlike anything you had worked with before, some of these people. He was just a wonderful, gentle, brilliant director. and who accepted us totally as a crew. And if we made a little mistake, well, that was all right. And he was like that on all his films.
That was the first year. Then Altman came back the second year. He was absolutely sure that he would get the studio the second year because he brought Hollywood to us the first year. Well, he discovered a fellow called Nickel was making Carnal Knowledge at the studio and had already booked it. And he was bringing McCabe and Mrs. Miller to us, or the Presbyterian Church Wager, as it was originally called. And so he was without a studio. We didn't have another studio in those days. The bridge didn't exist. So he went up north of the civilization in Caulfields and discovered there's a basin back in there that's now full of houses. Then it was just a wilderness.
And so we started building the town and prepping the movie. And it was really a great experience because we shot the film, all the exteriors in continuity. We had all our carpenters dressed in period clothing using period tools. And so they were working during the shots.
Years later, I met the producer of that film. His name is Brewer. And we were talking, and I said, at some point, he said, oh, you know, I produced McCabe and Mrs. Miller. And I said, oh, I said, I did know that. I said, I always thought it was a little bit odd on McCabe and Mrs. Miller because the movie that we were shooting just didn't seem to be the movie that became. And he got quite disturbed and said, well, you know, Bob was one of the reasons he chose to work up there was to be as far away from the studio as possible.
We rented a house just below the location where we had the editing rooms and screening and everything. And I know that Lou Lombardo, who again just passed away a couple months ago, they were cutting a separate picture. They were cutting their version and sending one to Warner Brothers.
Projects that that we as Westerners could produce and develop for television or for big screen were few and far between.
We had to start from scratch and learn how to do it. There was a job to be done, and you figured out how to do it.
Well, Phil wanted to get another series going. I mean, he really wanted, as much as anything, for BC to have another series going, as much as he wanted to necessarily run it. He had done Caribou Country, and that had been incredibly successful, and that had done a lot for the CBC, and it had done a lot for the community. And yes, Phil had done a lot of other good things by that point. There still wasn't much to do outside of the CBC. There were a few other things to do, but the CBC was still a pretty good bet at that particular point. And so I would imagine he wanted to stay there because of some of that security, and there wasn't that much to do outside. I mean, CFTC didn't exist, much less Telefilm and BC Film. It was a bit raw out there at that point. It's not that there weren't things going on, but the level that he wanted to work, it was pretty hard to get things together.
In the schedule of the CBC at that time, Walt Disney was on air at, I forget, 7:30, whatever it was, but there was a slot. And in this business, you start looking at other things than the value of the particular story that you're doing. And there was a 7 o'clock time period, slot from 7 to 7:30, which had a show called Adventures in Rainbow Country in it. And Adventures in Rainbow Country had ended because they'd run out of money and they couldn't refinance it. And CBC was desperate for an early evening entertainment drama. Okay. And I said, let's invent one. Right? And we invented the idea, let's use the BC coast, let's use the water and the mountains, and let's combine that with comedy. Toronto CBC will never want to do that. They want to do adult, big-time stuff. Let's us sneak in there and do something that will be popular entertainment.
Talk to practically anybody who's evolved here, and they did something on the Beachcombers, be it in any of the departments, any of the areas.
Looking back at it, it was just a discovery every day. We're trying to find out how to do things. How do you do a bullet hit? How do you get a fire to burn? And trying to maintain the continuity of a fire for 6-7 hours, right? And and now when I go on a set, and I see the special effects guy go throw the thing down, put it down. It's like he's been taught how to do it, but he hasn't gone through the experience of actually trying to do a real one.
It was a labor of love, which in those days, more or less anybody that was involved in the film business in the 60s, 70s when I got involved in it, into the early 80s, were in it because of the artistic value. It was what they wanted to do. They chose the business. It was not like that for me. The business sort of chose me, and I sort of got into it by default. But you know, it was also really interesting, and I mean, I was learning something every day. I have 4 kids, and I could go home and you know, talk to them about it. They were involved in it. They were being on the set a lot. They were extras. My kids all worked in the show in some capacity over the years and learned a lot. So it was another learning experience, which is, as a parent, that's what you want for your family and yourself.
The thought of us having barges out in the middle of the ocean and shooting off some dock somewhere was unheard of. So the ability to do that and to essentially take a building and have all the trucks around it and plug it in and turn it into a studio. Phil Keatley was the forerunner of that concept by finding a place that worked for a series and then bringing everything to it.
You guys coming up here sort of affected the whole town. You know, it was a big thing for a film crew to arrive in Gibson's, even though it was basically a smaller film crew than we were used to seeing in the streets of Vancouver and anywhere nowadays.
Wow.
But it was a major effect. I mean, it stopped traffic and everything, and the locals seemed to kind of put up.
Yeah, a lot of people moved up to the Sunshine Coast after that series was on the air.
It was extraordinary. And you talk about sort of who watched it. Because there was only really the one national television network at that point. I mean, CTV existed, but it hadn't sort of really established itself yet. And Beachcombers used to get 2.5 million people on occasion watching it. And there was one night when 1 out of every 3 English-speaking Canadians at 7 o'clock that night was sitting watching Beach.
You know, the industry wasn't cohesive yet. It wasn't yet a place where you could make a living.
If you could spell film in those days, you could be in the film business. And everybody invited their friends, and you know, everybody, there wasn't film schools or anything. People just showed up. It's friends of friends of friends, and it was a really good community in those days. So we had a lot of fun.
We had one picture every year or so, as opposed to 30 or 40 pictures going at any given time in Vancouver. So at that time, you needed a day job.
We had a sister union, which was a stage local, and a lot of us worked in the stage and did rock and roll and stuff like that. That kept a lot of us going because there still wasn't a lot of work, you know.
It was exciting to be part of that because I felt like I was part of a family that was starting to build something, and we're all kind of going in fear and trepidation because we weren't sure when the next show was going to come, because realistically there were months and months and months when there wasn't any work.
We didn't really think of being together in terms of what departments we worked in. Although we all had our specialized departments, everybody of course, but it was like a team effort, and the drivers worked amongst the crew.
Everybody knew each other. Even the different departments used to meet. You know, there were maybe 20 set decorators, maybe 5 props people.
People would do shows for nothing. Ron Oreo, I remember when I was starting out, Ron Oreo was doing some film for somebody, but they didn't have any money, so the whole crew worked for nothing. Everybody went over to somebody's cabin over in Bowen Island, and we ate beans and stayed for 2 or 3 days, slept in tents. Nobody cared, nobody said anything, and nobody got paid a penny, just the film processing costs. And like I say, they did it for the love of the business. They didn't care about, nobody did it to see how much money they could make and who could make the most money and who could have the most toys. They didn't care.
We all know Kosygin is coming, but does he have to arrive 3 days before Christmas, driving the wrong way down House Street? It was a very complicated picture that was shot, it was all exterior. 3 weeks of it was on the roof of the Vancouver Hotel.
There was all kinds of complaints because we were blocking the streets and around the Hotel Vancouver and the art gallery.
The Vancouver Sun had about 3 pictures on the front page of total chaos of traffic, body coming down from the roof of the Vancouver Hotel, and that and a number of other things had me pulled up in front of the police commission, and I believe that happened 3 times, 2 or 3 times.
It was the beginning of thinking for locations. We've got to have some commission. We've got to do something here to get these things organized.
Film commissions were being set up in many of the states. One was already, I don't know whether it was already working in Alberta, but they had the first one.
We actually lobbied 3 governments before Grace McCarthy acknowledged the fact that this would be a great idea.
Enough people were trying to build on the Alberta experience that it all came together. You know, I think that it was totally a combination of, you know, the government paying attention to us for the first time.
We were looking for business. We had inherited an empty treasury. We needed to create jobs. We needed the business, and we needed to give, I guess, opportunities for business. And it was a very small investment to create such a large business.
That was 75, and by 1978, the government actually initiated our first film commission.
5 years prior to that, we'd done a little over just around $3.5 million worth of business, including we just started doing TV movies, but we'd done about $3.5 million worth of business. In the first 6 months, we did $17.5 million worth of business. And then next year, we did $38 million worth of business.
And Grace McCarthy alone was instrumental in getting that position created, setting aside the budget to make it work. And she deserves all the credit for that, because that has resulted in what is now a $1 billion industry, and she really should take that credit, because it is hers alone.
Gray Fox was a film that many say was the best film we've produced out here, indigenous film. It started in the West as a story that was developed because of the Kamloops connection. It ultimately had to be financed by the fledgling telefilm of the time.
It was the best, biggest indigenous movie that had been done to that point. There had been a lot of low-budget features that we had scraped out of here. There had been some service features that had run through here. Phil managed to pull together the biggest, the best indigenous, independent Canadian film that had run out of Vancouver.
It was the first British Columbia film that made an international impact.
There were things in it that turned heads. There was the quality of Frank Tidy's work, which it was just a postcard. Every shot was beautiful, whether it was in the gray and the grit and the mud with Bill Miner beside a train, or whether it was a beauty shot in a village or in the forest. There was something just grabbing about the look of the movie.
Phil was very Hungarian, moody, temperamental, effervescent, immense energy, and then it seemed as though someone had punched him in the stomach and all the energy went out of him and he would just be there, and you'd have to get a coffee into him to revive him. And here was this kid who was 22 or something.
No, he'd already done 3 award-winning shorts. Don't forget. I mean, he wasn't just this raw kid who had never done anything. He had made his mark and created 3 extraordinary essays, film essays.
He knew how to relate that story to film, and how to take that and cut it so that really when you looked at it
things just became alive, you know.
Phil was certainly big. He was important to the whole community. His existence was, just the fact of what he had done and how he had managed to do it was important. I don't know if he changed the community all that much. He gave a lot of, maybe he did, maybe he gave a lot of people faith that we could actually pull off major productions on an Indigenous level, not just a service industry level. So maybe he was really important.
We had largely taken Panorama Studios at Folkestone Way in West Van for granted. We'd done some beautiful big pictures there. It was a reason for us being.
Panorama going away was really sad, and we all tried to save it, but I don't think it was a critical loss to the industry at the time. It certainly wasn't perceived to be, I don't think, by anyone. I think what it did do, though, was it motivated certain people, not very many, but certain people, to get very political and to point out the value of creating a more efficient space.
We were already shooting at Dominion Bridge. It had been abandoned. It had broken windows and pigeons flying around and water dripping everywhere, freezing cold, unheated.
They washed buses here. That's what they did. It was owned by the government, and they stored buses and old streetcars and a whole lot of junk. But it took money, and the lobby effort in particular, dealing with politicians and dealing with other people, it meant that we were constantly in need of money. And that's when I went to Gunter Henning at Alpha Cine Labs at the time and told him about this wonderful opportunity.
Gunter was a German immigrant after the Second World War. He was actually in the German Army, wounded in the German Army in the Second World War. Came to Canada sometime after that, ended up in Flin Flon and was a documentary cameraman and a documentary director, and became quite successful. Had a lab out there in Winnipeg, and decided sometime in the late 70s to move to Vancouver. And he moved to Vancouver and bought Alpha Cine from a man by the name of Les Davis.
He was the most credible businessman, Gunther Henning was, in our midst. We're all on a committee meeting with the minister of whatever to decide how the provincial government was going to fund this studio.
MacGyver was really one of the first, if not the biggest, series ever to hit Vancouver. And by locating here and being the first shows in the recently developed sound stages here, they put the bridge on the map.
From every part of the United States, from around the world, millions more will come to share in the rejoicing, to share in this magnificent experience of Expo 86, 86, 86, 86, 86.
Expo 86 really did help the industry tremendously, because once it was over, the fair itself, it opened up a lot of space in hotels and other facilities that made themselves available to the industry. So from that respect, I think it was just people discovered another place that they may not have known very much about, especially from south of us, people who came up from California.
And our industry was the fresh place for producers from Hollywood, I'll use the word Hollywood as a broad term, who wanted to get somewhere where it reminded them of what it was like to make movies when they started, where the people were ready to go, they were gung-ho, they were enthusiastic, there wasn't high cost, there wasn't fight over labor jurisdiction, it was just a place where it was nice to go and make movies. Everybody
was willing to help one another. There was always a way to make it work. There wasn't the sort of, well, we couldn't possibly do that. The can-do attitude was definitely there.
In that sort of cusp that we went over, 84, 85, 86, in that area, when the producers that were coming up here were bringing key members of their crew, they were bringing a lot of money, and they were making good movies here. But they went away looking over their shoulder. I went, God, that was great. I love those people. You know, they worked hard. I'm going to go back and I like that guy and I like that girl. I don't need to bring this guy from LA. Look at the money I can save to put on the screen when I can hire somebody local. And we developed a loyalty, kind of a Friends of BC client base that people just loved to come up here. And I think some of them actually coveted it. They tried to keep it secret so it was their place where they had locations that hadn't been shot to death. You know, and they managed to explore some fresh new talent both in front and behind the camera.
We viewed it as a location, and we discovered that there was a burgeoning talent pool there, not huge at the time.
Television, going on the road, that was it. That was the biggest single thing that changed the course of our history.
Everybody in LA was saying, "Oh no, you can't move a show up to Canada. You can't move, you know. I mean, you got to have your soundstage. You got to. It's all the stuff." Well, they had forgotten that we didn't use those big Mitchell cameras anymore. That we were using Panavision cameras. We had steady cams. We didn't have to lay track. We had lighting packages that were those little inky lights that you could plug into the wall. We didn't have to generate power with a generator and cables. We could literally plug into any building we were in and just borrow from their power. You know, the film was really fast, so you didn't have to burn actors up with light. And the whole thing had been scaled down, you know, so we didn't need those sound stages. There was a little tiny apartment. You could run the cameras right through the doors, and there was not, you know, so you didn't need the sound stage. We could shoot completely practical. And I had already with Hunter and A-Team and several of my other shows have been shooting in warehouses. That worked great. So I just uprooted my show Stingray and took it to Canada.
Nobody really realized that that was a change for Vancouver, but they became aware pretty shortly after that they were formalizing what was.
I think their first run was to take Stingray over to Calgary. And they shot there for a while, and I guess until the winter closed in on them or something or the other, but they moved that show back here. And they got entrenched here. I think they even had a bit of a studio space in an old warehouse over on 4th Avenue in Vancouver, West 4th.
In those days, Stephen Cannell was doing, most of the shows I worked with him on were kind of cop show based. So they needed a gritty area. Vancouver was on the same time frame. I think they liked, I mean, most productions like working out of Vancouver, mainly because 9 o'clock in the office here, it's 9 o'clock in the office in LA, so you don't want to have a meeting, get on the first flight here in the morning at 7 o'clock, and you can be at a meeting in any office in LA by 10.
Locations were cheap. I mean, wise guy could go out and rent somebody's house for $200, you know, and you want to park your car in my driveway, not a problem. Well, we've grown, it changes. There were also very few, nobody knew much about permits in those days either. So happily the streets were blocked, you know, and Vancouver said, oh, there's movies in town, this is wonderful.
It played right into their ability to be able to make product for the price they had to make it. That was what he was seeking.
Out of that, I mean, came Jump Street, and Jump Street, you know, did pretty good business and started sending the word out. Hey, you know what? You can make a movie there for a price. You don't get eaten alive. The Canadian government doesn't chew you up and spit you out, and the crews are okay. And that's the word. It was all word of mouth, because that's what Hollywood's about, is word of mouth and relationships. It's never about what your press releases say or advertising. They don't believe that crap because, you know, they sell BS, they don't buy it.
Steve Cannell was a real classy guy. Like, he'd have a workshop every year, bring all his production people from Canada or wherever we were down, and we'd go to, you know, some kind of a golf resort usually, because everybody was golfers. And Stephen would pay for everything. He would never, ever, I mean, it was first class this, first class that. I mean, it was really a nice company to work for, and he was a very generous guy, and knew everybody. Steve, I've heard him say many times, was dyslexic. Well, I don't ever remember that side of Steve Cannell.
For a long time in the trade papers, there was one columnist, I can't remember even now which one it was, but he would every year list the shows in Canada that were being shot in Canada that had failed you know, on television. It's like, you can't shoot a show in Canada. No, Americans don't want to see it. Well, I busted that wide open with 21 Jump Street, and you know, and then those guys finally shut up.
Within the next 18 months, things started to shift. Suddenly, television was going on the road. Suddenly, Stephen Cannell wanted to have, you know, his own studio, and it all just fit together.
On the day the studio opened, he said, well, if this doesn't work or things get ugly, I'll turn it into a shoe factory. You know, I mean, he was quite pragmatic about the whole thing. He was here to save money, and if anybody wanted to fool with that, he was quite prepared to do something else. And I think that's a very important position to take, because, you know, whenever you've got bricks and mortar and heavy asset investment, that's when people start taking advantage of you. You know, that's when you cease to be a guy with a bag of money making a movie that can go anywhere. And that's where it can get dangerous. And he knew that.
I think the big thing that changed the face of Vancouver was Stephen Cannell coming to Vancouver and building, you know, putting together North Shore Studios. I think that really changed the face of the industry in Vancouver.
2/3 of the production managers in this town went through the Cannell organization, either as assistant directors or directly as production people. Here, they were, you know, I can't speak enough of what they were for the background and development in this town.
I mean, it's always an interesting thing to ponder what creates a cult response to something.
When I came to Fox, they were very interested in me doing something for Fox, so it was the natural place to pitch it. And it was the natural place for a show like The X-Files, which was unlike anything else on TV, because Fox was, they were taking some chances at the time. They were the fourth network. They were able to, I think, take some risks that the other networks weren't.
The look that Chris wanted to establish could not be established in LA. And he started wandering north. It could have been established in Oregon, it could have been established in Washington, but the economics weren't there.
The look that John Bartley gave the show in the first couple of years, it's pretty unique. There really wasn't anything like it on television. And you know, it got very dark and shadowy and moody, and the producers weren't afraid of that. They loved it, and it turned out that the audience loved it.
The X-Files created an image that worked for us in that way, and it created a mood and a sense and all that green and that depth of color.
It's really hard to create a look for a show. It's something that I think I've always thought about, because, you know, if you're doing a series, you have to have a look for it. And technically, you know, what should happen is people should flip around the channels, and without even knowing it, they should look at the show and think, that's the show, that's X-Files, that's NYPD Blue, that's ER, you know, without even having to look up TV Guide.
Chris Carter created a mood, and that's what sold.
I mean, X-Files isn't the most perfect show in the world, and all the individual shows, there's some great ones and there are some not so great ones, but they always were willing to take risks, and they were always willing to kind of push the envelope with story and character and stuff, and go places where, you know, quite often the network didn't want them to go.
In order to make a show like The X-Files a success, you did have to persevere for quite a while. You didn't just drop out after the first season if, you know, the ratings weren't there where you'd like them to be. You didn't just pull the plug on it and say, no, we're not going to bring this back. They stuck it out for 3 full seasons before it really caught on. So you really have to hand it to the people, not just Chris, but obviously he was quite instrumental in making that happen. But I think the people at Fox also really believed in the project, and they felt that it did have legs.
The X-Files gave me many things. It gave me, I have wonderful relationships as a result of it in my life. I've got some success that gives me some opportunities I wouldn't have had otherwise. It was a chance to do great work. I came to love Vancouver, which I really consider my home away from home. Yeah, I would do it again. It was painful in many ways and at many times. It was a tremendous amount of hard work. I gave up a lot of my life to it because it just takes that kind of sort of very focused and kind of crazy attention to detail if you want it to be good. So yeah, I have to say I would do it again, but I might do it differently.
We really did, in the very beginning, take the position that we really wanted to make it happen. Frankly, now we're over $1 billion, and for many of the people, the 10,000 or 12,000 workers, depending upon whose statistics you believe, a lot of that has come down to it's a job.
In the old days, people who wanted to get in the industry stood on the staircase for a long time and waited, and after a while they actually, you know, got soaking wet, but they got let in the door, and it was really quite campy. Now it seems that there's a formula to get in, and the screening process isn't as strict.
There is a sense of cynicism that sets in if people don't watch it. They begin to think, oh, another bloody movie, another blooming set, or oh yeah, it's boring, boring, boring. And this is the challenge that members have to meet.
Film is a subculture. It's a lifestyle, and then it's a job, and in that order. And if you can't accept that, if you're looking for an 8-and-skate job, you probably shouldn't be in this business, because it's not that kind of a job. And I regret that there are more and more people whose modus operandi is what's in it for me.
Do you see millions of dollars going to actors when you're being asked to take a cut in pay? Is that fair? No, probably not, actually. Millions of dollars go to producers. Millions of dollars, smaller millions of dollars go to directors. And you're working for very good wages considering any other industry in the world, and you get fabulous food and stuff like that. But you work long hours. I think it's a good trade. Clearly, you don't want to, kill the goose that laid the golden egg.
That's something that every film community has to really be cognizant of, is that attitudes can get way out of control. Demands can be just, leave that stuff to the stars. We're the people who make the movies.
A general concept in Vancouver's huge success story that is a little different from Toronto's huge success story. Toronto has always maintained about probably 30% to 40% Indigenous Canadian production, and Canadian directors getting features off the ground, movies off the ground, and certainly series off the ground. It has not been that successful in Vancouver. Vancouver has had huge success as a service facility. It always concerned me, and I think some other people as well, that if the dollar ever changed, or if circumstances changed, that the Americans didn't want to shoot here anymore, we'd be left with virtually nothing.
There's an old saying that anything is possible as long as you don't care who takes credit for it. And that was very true here, because nobody really cared, and who took credit for it. So there's some people who have stood up, and but they flamed out really quickly, because we helped them a little, but but that was the whole strength, and the whole strength behind putting the business together here, right? And we all wanted a piece of the action, and that's why we did it, right? But it really was an unselfish effort on people's part. They gave unstintingly of their time and their work, and when they could, their resources. And if you needed one of them tonight to do something for you, I know 12 guys I could call on to be there in a minute, no matter what it was.
I can't imagine a more exciting thing than to be at the beginning of something. Anything. I don't know name it. I think the beginning of something is so fascinating. After you have it, after you've made it, after it exists, that's a much harder place to be. Because then you're trying to maintain something or modify your vision, or, it's just trickier.